All right, so let's talk a little bit more about some of these difficult ideas stemming from Kant. And let's talk a little bit more about some of these difficult ideas stemming from Kant and the ideas in this week's lecture. There's this interrelationship between the ideas of freedom, physical laws, the moral law, universal laws, causation and explanation, emotions, freedom, and physical law. And these are just the prompts that you're given for preparing for this week's quiz. So let's start with the idea of physical laws. We covered this in the lecture as well as all these ideas, but this is just a backup if you find this more useful or if you need more examples and explanation. So when it comes to physical laws, Kant's idea is that physical law explains everything that occurs within the physical universe. In fact, Kant thinks that for the most part, events are just completely unintelligible unless they fall under laws of some type. So in the lecture, we gave the example of something like billiard balls falling, or let's imagine that I'm asking myself, what would happen if I dropped my glasses here? Everyone knows that if I hold my glasses above the earth somewhere and drop them, they're going to fall. And if I asked you, why did those glasses fall? Everyone is going to give me the same answer, probably if they're above third grade level. The answer they're going to give is it fell because of gravity. So we have an event here. The event is just the glasses falling. And then that event has a certain explanation. And the explanation works because it references a universal law. Gravity makes things fall down. Another way of saying this is just to say that in any event of this type, which is basically in any event where there are two objects, one of them is very massive, and they're near each other, they are going to move toward each other inversely proportional to their mass and distance and such, right? But the key idea here is just that the only reason this object falling was explicable in that scenario is because we could give a universal law according to which this type of event always happens in these types of circumstances. Imagine that the law of gravity wasn't there, and sometimes I released my glasses, they flew up into the air, sometimes they did a twirl and flew out the window, and this was just a random series of different kinds of reactions. In a situation like that, if my glasses did a twist and flew out the window and someone said why, it would literally be an inexplicable event because there is no law determining what happens in these kinds of situations. So Kant has an argument that the very possibility of explanation for a physical event requires that we can subsume that physical event as falling under physical laws, which determine what happens in these types of events. We can't explain that something caused something else unless we can say one event followed another because of these laws which determine that that second event would follow. So that's physical laws. But Kant is going to say the same thing must be true about moral law as well. So now onto the moral law. Imagine a situation where you're trying to explain what someone ought to do and why. Let's say your kid brother got angry over some trivial thing and decided to hit his friend Jim. You talk to your kid brother and he says, why can't I hit Jim? Explain to me why I can't do that, why it's morally not okay. In order to explain to your kid brother on Kant's view why that was wrong, you would need some kind of a universal principle to explain the wrongness of that act. In this case, you'd probably say something like, well, other people deserve to be respected and treated with kindness, except in certain perhaps intervening circumstances, right? So the reason it's not okay to hit Jim is because this is an event of the type which is doing harm to other people in an unkind way that wasn't justified by what they did to you. We have the individual event. You did this to Jim. That event is of the kind wrong, and we explain that event by subsuming it under a moral law, which shows that these kinds of things are wrong. This also explains why, for Kant, moral laws have to be universal laws. Because if they're not laws that explain what would apply to anyone who's in a similar situation, then they don't really explain anything. So let's imagine that your kid brother hit Jim and you explain why it was wrong. The next day, your kid brother hits Tim in a very similar situation for the same reason in the same way. And your kid brother says, was that wrong? And you say, no, in this case, it was fine. Nothing about the situation, just like one was wrong, one was right, even though they're basically the same kind of thing. In this case, your original claim that hitting Jim was wrong because it was an act of unprovoked unkindness, the explanation completely falls apart, because if another act of similar unkindness wasn't also wrong, then your principle, which was used to explain why the first act was wrong, just falls apart. In other words, if it was wrong to take an act that was unprovoked unkindness, if those kinds of acts are wrong, then it should apply in any similar case, because that's what a law, and that's just how explanation works in general on Kant's view. The universal principle, a general principle, explains a specific case. And for the most part, when we explain things, that's how we will explain them. So Kant's going to say that both physical and moral laws must be universal laws. They must be laws which apply in all similar situations if there's going to be explanation at all. And we'll see it's not just about explanation for Kant, but it's also about causation. Causation is just the idea that one event causes another event. And as we saw in the lecture, Kant thinks that that's necessary for explanation, and explanation is closely related to causation. And this gets to the idea that Kant believes that there are only two kinds of causation that exist, at least in the human universe. Some things happen because they're following physical laws. Some things happen because they're following moral laws. Now, Kant does not believe that acts that follow physical laws are free. Why? Because we don't choose those acts. I chose to release my glasses, but I didn't choose that they fall, right? I couldn't have chosen to stop that law. I didn't choose that the law of gravity is there. The law of gravity is there whether I chose it or not. So physical laws are not an example of freedom. They happen whether we choose it or not. We can't choose the law. We can't undo the law of gravity. And it's important to point out that for Kant, when I'm following my normal psychology, including my desires are within this system of physical law, my physical psychology. They are bound by these laws of causation on Kant's view that are outside of my own choice and moral act. So Kant thinks your psychology, when we do psychology from the point of view of a scientific perspective, or when we do psychology at all, what we're doing is explaining our behavior by putting it under these laws that we didn't choose. The individual psychology of Kant doesn't matter that much, but think of any psychological theory that we have. Almost all of them are going to say, you took this act because of this, let's say, biochemical event in your brain. You did this act because of this sociological conditioning that you were given. You did this act because of this thing that happened in your childhood. All of these kinds of explanation are saying you took act X because event Y, which you didn't control, happened before that. And this psychological principle is also one you didn't choose. According to most psychological theories, what they're going to say is this is just a law of how people behave. So if I'm explaining my behavior on Kant's view using my desire or anything else, let alone physical law, right? If I'm explaining my behavior by using my neurochemistry. My neurochemistry, what happens in my brain, those things follow laws of chemistry, laws of physics that determine how a neurochemical signal gets sent down my neurons and eventually ends in me acting. So in Kant's view, anytime I act, if it's not explicable by the moral law, it's going to be explicable by physical laws. And the only kinds of actions that people take, that humans take, are following the moral law and following physical law. Everything else that we see in the world around us, right, is just following physical laws. A rock isn't choosing to fall from the sky. It just follows physical laws. Human beings follow those same natural laws, except when they follow the moral law. Why do we know that any action must follow one or the other, the physical or the moral law? Because, like we saw earlier, Kant believes that explanation only exists at all in a realm where laws determine how actions will occur. So that basic explanation requires that there's a law explaining some event. Okay, so then how is the moral law different? Kant believes that if I follow the moral law, I'm actually determining the law according to which I will act. So I don't determine the law of gravity, the laws of momentum and propulsion, or any other kinds of laws, biochemistry. I don't determine any of these laws. They exist and I cannot change them. But with the action that I take, if I follow the moral law, Kant says I can choose the moral law. For example, I can choose the principle upon which I act, even though I can't choose those other physical things. So Kant believes that in cases where I follow this higher law, the moral law, which as we'll see later on is something like treat all people as full rational agents who deserve respect. When I follow that principle, now my behavior can be explained by that principle. And now that act was actually an act of freedom because I chose the law that I acted on rather than it being a pre-existing law of my psychology or something else. I chose the principle I was going to act on, and I took that act as a result of choosing that principle. It still has to fall under a law, but that law is the moral law, and I chose the moral law. So that's why acts are free in the case of morality, moral acts that follow the moral law, according to Kant. But everything's going to follow a law. It's just a law that I chose. Those are the free things. A law I didn't choose. Those are the unfree things. Okay, so I'm looking back at the list here. The interrelationship of freedom, physical laws, the moral laws, universal laws, causation and explanation. And the last prompt here is emotions, freedom, and the physical law. So we can see now how all of these things fit together. Emotions for Kant are a part of my psychology. They're a part of those things that are explained by the physical causal processes in the ordinary world. Even if those things are primarily mental events, they're not really physical events, they're still going to fall under these causal patterns for Kant, which mean that they are deterministic. My psychology is just as deterministic for Kant as is billiard balls hitting each other or glasses falling with the law of gravity. So if I follow my emotions, like we saw last time, Kant believes I didn't choose my emotions just happen, and then I follow whichever emotion happens to be stronger and wins out. But that's not a story where I ever choose anything on Kant's view, because my emotions were already there. My emotions battle each other out for primacy, and the one with the most force wins. I didn't choose to have those emotions, and I didn't choose which one's stronger. And so in a way, I'm just kind of going with the flow, which for Kant is against freedom. The only time I act freely is when I say, regardless of the emotions, I'm going to act on this principle, which is the principle of morality, the moral law, respect all persons. And when I act according to the moral law, I'm getting beyond those things that already exist in me as determined factors. I'm setting up the law that I will follow, which determines what my act will be. And so that's a case of freedom. And that's why for Kant, he doesn't believe that freedom can come with emotional actions. Okay, well, the synopsis is in response to quite a few questions that I got from quite a few students asking for clarifications on these ideas. If it helps you understand the ideas, that's great. Hope the quiz goes well for you, and good luck with all the material this week.